David Rudabaugh was one of the many hard-edged figures who roamed the American frontier during the waning decades of the 19th century. A cattleman turned outlaw, whose name shows up alongside some of the West's most notorious legends. Today, he's often remembered by the nickname Dirty Dave, a label pinned to him long after his death due to claims that he avoided bathing and favored filthy clothes. But there's no real evidence he was called that in his lifetime. If anything, the name speaks more to how the myth of the Old West gets told than it does to who Rudabaugh really was. He was born in July 1854 in Fulton County, Illinois. Like many families caught in the upheaval of the Civil War, the Rudabaughs were left to pick up the pieces after tragedy struck. David's father died in conflict, and the surviving family eventually relocated to Eureka, Kansas in 1870. Before long, David set off on his own for good, drifting westward along the cattle trails into Colorado, and soon after, into the pages of frontier infamy. Details of Rudabaugh's early life remain scattered and vague, but by the early 1870s, he had clearly chosen a criminal path. He started showing up in Arkansas, running with a group of outlaws that included Milton Yarberry and mysterious Dave Mather, names that still carry weight in Old West lore. Together, they rustled cattle, robbed travelers, and were even suspected in the killing of a local rancher. Whether they made their way to Decatur, Texas, as some reports suggest, or split paths elsewhere, the record gets hazy. One way or another, Rudabaugh eventually turned up in the Black Hills of South Dakota, where he traded cattle rustling for a new line of work, holding up stagecoaches. By 1876, Rudabaugh had formed his own crew. Alongside fellow outlaws Mike Rourke and Dan DeMent, he created what came to be known as the Trio, a small gang that specialized in theft and rustling across the sparsely defended settlements of Texas. Rudabaugh was said to be their leader, and their operations left a trail of empty pockets and frightened towns in their wake. Some stories from this era add a layer of frontier romance, claiming that Rudabaugh once taught Doc Holliday how to handle a gun, while Doc, in return, gave him tips on how to win at cards. It's a great bit of Western folklore. Two notorious men swapping trades under the glow of a saloon lamp. But like many tales from this era, there's no hard proof it ever happened. Still, it's one of those stories that sticks, because in a place and time where the line between truth and legend was always a little bit blurry, a figure like Dave Rudabaugh fit right in. In the fall of 1876, David Rudabaugh's criminal path took a bold and dangerous turn. That October, he robbed a Santa Fe Railroad construction camp, and then vanished into the wide-open country of the Southern Plains. The brazen theft kicked off a manhunt that would set him on a collision course with some of the West's most iconic lawmen. Among them was none other than Wyatt Earp, who was issued a temporary commission as a deputy U.S. Marshal specifically to pursue Rudabaugh. Earp left Dodge City and rode hard, covering more than 400 miles in pursuit, his trail stretching deep into Texas, toward the rough settlement of Fort Griffin. By the time Earp reached the ramshackle town on the banks of the Clear Fork of the Brazos River, Rudabaugh had already come and gone. Hoping to dig up a lead, Earp stepped into the town's most well-known watering hole, the Shancy Saloon. It was owned by John Shancy, a man Earp had known for years, ever since refereeing bare-knuckled boxing matches in his younger days. Shancy admitted that Rudabaugh had passed through town just days earlier, but couldn't say for sure where he'd gone. However, he pointed Wyatt in the direction of a man who might know more, a sharp-tongued gambler and gunman by the name of Doc Holliday. At the time, Holliday had a reputation for despising lawmen, and Wyatt wasn't sure what kind of reception he'd get. But when he found Doc that evening back at the saloon, he was surprised to find the gambler calm and cooperative. Holliday shared that he believed Rudabaugh had circled back towards Kansas, a tip that would prove to be both accurate and instrumental. Earp wired the information to his ally, Bat Masterson, a fellow lawman in Kansas, and it helped set the stage for Rudabaugh's capture. That night also marked the beginning of Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday's friendship, an unlikely bond forged over whiskey, cards, and a shared enemy. As Doc had guessed, Rudabaugh had indeed returned north and quickly went back to his old habits. On January 27, 1878, he and 5 other men attempted to rob a train in Kinsley, Kansas. But the heist fell apart, and the law closed in fast. Within days, Rudabaugh and his accomplice, Edgar West, were captured by Sheriff Bat Masterson and his posse, which included Marshal John Joshua Webb. When Rudabaugh reached for his gun, Webb was even faster, forcing him to surrender without a fight. The remaining gang members were arrested shortly thereafter. Faced with prison, Rudabaugh chose self-preservation instead. He turned on his partners, offering information in exchange for leniency and promising to reform. His betrayal landed his accomplices behind bars, but Rudabaugh himself was given a second chance. Unfortunately, that promise to go straight didn't last long. Before the year was out, Dirty Dave had drifted south into New Mexico, the land of enchantment, where he quickly slipped back into the life he knew best, one of theft, one of violence, and one of lawless roads. By 1879, Dave Rudabaugh had found his way back into familiar company and deeper into trouble. Reuniting with old partners from his Kansas days, he helped form what would come to be known as the Dodge City Gang, a loosely organized group of outlaws and crooked officials who turned Las Vegas, New Mexico, into a personal playground of crime. For the better part of 6 months, the gang made their mark through a series of bold train and stagecoach robberies. This crew included some infamous names of the frontier: Mysterious Dave Mather, Joe Carson, Justice of the Peace Hoodoo Brown, and the aforementioned Marshal J.J. Webb, who had arrested Rudabaugh back in Kansas. Now, the two rode side by side, with Webb and other lawmen helping shield the gang from prosecution. On October 14, 1879, a train in the Las Vegas, New Mexico area was held up by masked men. The thieves walked away with just over $2,000 in cash, a few six-shooters, and oddly enough, every single lantern from the train. At the time, the culprits vanished without a trace. But when Rudabaugh was finally captured 2 years later, he admitted to being one of the men behind the robbery. The lawlessness didn't end there. In early 1880, tensions in Las Vegas came to a violent head. On January 22nd, 4 local men, T.J. House, James West, John Dorsey, and William Randall, spent the night stirring up trouble, swaggering through town, looking for a fight. When they entered the Close and Patterson Variety Hall, Marshal Joe Carson tried to disarm them, but they refused. A gunfight erupted inside the saloon. Carson was killed on the spot. Deputy Mather returned fire, killing Randall and fatally wounding West. House and Dorsey, though bloodied, managed to escape. 2 weeks later, Rudabaugh and a posse that included J.J. Webb tracked the fugitives to a house in Buena Vista, 30 miles to the north. The gang surrounded the home and demanded surrender. Dorsey and House gave up after being promised protection, but that promise meant nothing. Once the prisoners were returned to the Las Vegas jail, a mob of vigilantes stormed in, overpowering the guards and dragging the men to the town plaza. Before the lynchings could be carried out, though, the widow of Marshal Carson opened fire on the crowd, forcing the vigilantes to scatter and leave the executions unfinished. But justice wasn't done. The Dodge City Gang kept up their lawless streak, and Rudabaugh stayed in the thick of it. Their luck began to unravel when J.J. Webb, acting in his role as city marshal, shot and killed a man named Mike Kellier. Webb was arrested, convicted of murder, and sentenced to hang. A lynch mob again gathered quickly, but Rudabaugh, acting as the gang's de facto leader, rallied the remaining members and managed to keep the crowd at bay. Not willing to let Webb hang, Rudabaugh made a desperate move. On April 30th, he and an accomplice named John Allen stormed the sheriff's office in a violent jailbreak attempt. The raid failed, but not without bloodshed. Rudabaugh shot and killed jailer Antonio Lino Valdez in the chaos. Webb's sentence was eventually repealed and reduced to life in prison, but the gang's heyday was coming to an end. Their violent streak had pushed too far, and the weight of justice, or vengeance in this case, is beginning to close in. By the early 1880s, Dave Rudabaugh's life had devolved into a frantic scramble for survival, shifting from one lawless frontier to the next. After killing Lino Valdez, he fled with fellow outlaw Tom Pickett to Fort Sumner, New Mexico, where they fell in with the infamous Billy the Kid. Billy the Kid was, and still is, considered one of, if not the most, infamous outlaw to ever walk the high plains of the Old West. And yet, legend goes that Billy himself feared no man on earth, except for one. And that man was none other than Dave Rudabaugh. Whether true or not, it speaks volumes about the reputation Dirty Dave had carved out for himself. On November 30th, 1880, Rudabaugh, Billy the Kid, and Billy Wilson rode into White Oaks, New Mexico, where tensions were already high. The townsfolk had little patience for the outlaws, and Deputy James Redmond didn't hesitate to confront them. Rudabaugh reportedly fired at Redmond on a whim, prompting a shootout and a swift retreat from town. The trio fled to a nearby ranch owned by Jim Greathouse, whom they took hostage. When lawmen arrived the next morning, the outlaws traded Greathouse for a volunteer negotiator, Deputy James Carlisle. Hours passed as both sides remained locked in a tense standoff. Then, just before midnight, a man burst through the window, Carlisle, only to be gunned down in the chaos. It remains unclear whether the fatal shot came from the posse or the outlaws, but either way, the incident brought the siege to an abrupt end. The lawmen retreated, and Rudabaugh and his companions slipped away under the cover of night. Though Billy the Kid was later blamed for Carlisle's death, the truth was never firmly established. Their freedom didn't last long either. On December 19th, the gang rode back into Fort Sumner, unaware that Pat Garrett and a posse were lying in wait. As the outlaws approached, the lawmen sprung from hiding. Tom Pickett and Tom O'Folliard were gunned down in the ambush. Rudabaugh's horse was shot out from under him, but he managed to leap onto Wilson's and escape. They regrouped at an abandoned cabin in a desolate stretch called Stinking Springs. Just days later, Garrett's men tracked them to the cabin and laid siege. Charlie Baudry was shot when he stepped too close to a window. The rest huddled inside, trapped and low on options. By the next morning, Rudabaugh finally waved a white flag, signaling his surrender. This was the end of the line. Rudabaugh was taken back to Las Vegas, New Mexico to stand trial. Hoping to avoid the noose, he pled guilty to a train robbery from 1879. The court wasn't interested in deals. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to hang. Locked away in the Old Town Jail, ironically the same place where his old partner, J.J. Webb, was now serving a life sentence, Rudabaugh didn't plan to wait around. On September 19, 1881, Rudabaugh, Webb, and two other inmates staged another desperate jailbreak. The attempt failed, leaving another man dead. Undeterred, they tried again 2 months later, this time with success. They chiseled a small hole through the jail wall and slipped away into the night. Rudabaugh and Webb fled to Texas and then crossed the border into Mexico. While Webb eventually resurfaced in Kansas under a false name and died of smallpox in 1882, Rudabaugh's trail went cold. What became of Dirty Dave remains one of the Old West's enduring mysteries. The most widely accepted version has him dying violently in Mexico. On February 18, 1886, he allegedly got into a deadly dispute over a card game in Parral, Chihuahua. After killing 2 men, he returned to the cantina in the dark and was ambushed, decapitated, and paraded around town by his killers. Other stories paint different endings. One where he settled in Montana, married, and drank himself to death in Oregon in the roaring 20s. Another placed him with Soapy Smith's criminal enterprise in Colorado, where he perished during a riot near Cripple Creek. Whatever the truth, Dave Rudabaugh's name lingers in Western legend. He remains the only known outlaw who have crossed paths with all the towering figures of the frontier: Pat Masterson, Pat Garrett, Doc Holliday, Wyatt Earp, Dave Mather, and Billy the Kid. His life, soaked in blood, dust, and a mysterious fate as cold cases get, speaks to the chaotic yet connective tissue of icons of the Old West.